Alright, this is Big Boss from Foxhound Woods Ball coming to you from Fort Lauderdale and from my blog page over at outerheavenpaintball.blogspot.com. I'm also repping the guys from Acid Tactical, so you could check them out over at acidtactical.com. Anyway, for all you guys that are just subscribed to the channel and are beginning to see some of my content, I'm a diehard military history freak, so I will try to do things in that category. And I watch a lot of YouTube, and I was going through some videos to try to get some inspiration for creating some content for my stuff, and somehow I found videos of gear loadouts for the 1991 Persian Gulf War, Operation Desert Storm. And some of these videos, it's like either the delivery was decent, or you had some of these kids that thought it was cutesy because they were kids trying to explain this stuff, and it's like, no, I can't watch it like this. So I just said, fuck it, I'll make content for it. I'll try to deliver the best one I can about the history, the uniforms, the weapons, the gear. And with that being said, I will say that we need more of this kind of historical recreationism in paintball. It's like, you go look at Milsim West events that are out on the West Coast. You see guys like Blue Jean Operator, Spartan 117, and the kind of content they generate. And I'll admit, that's the kind of stuff that keeps me going with the paintball stuff. I see Wolf, I've seen all the stuff that Necro was doing with SAS back in the days, and it's like, we need more of that shit in today's world. And hell, let's keep the shit going. But before we kick off the video, let's have a word from our friends and sponsors over at Acid Tactical, so you can check them out over at acidtactical.com. We'll be back right after this.
Good evening. It is a prescription for war, this Iraqi invasion of Kuwait, the tiny country that is a primary source of oil for much of the Western world. But tonight, the United States, the Soviet Union, Israel, and other powers are concentrating on diplomatic and economic solutions to this surprising and dangerous development. The invasion by 100,000 Iraqi troops backed by air cover and tanks was brutally efficient. Iraq wants control of Kuwait's territory, its oil, and the money that comes with it.
8 years of brutal, unmitigated war between Iraq and Iran. The Iraqi military could claim some kind of victory, or at least their dictator, Saddam Hussein, could. With that being said, by the time 1990 rolled around, Iraq was deep in debt from fighting the war with the Iranians, and he set his sights on the oil-rich nation of Kuwait. Mixed in with a bit of paranoia and the desire to raid Kuwait's oil fields for himself, Saddam launched a brutal invasion and occupied it. Into this fight jumped the United States, as well as many of their nations, in a coalition of European and Middle Eastern countries to oust Saddam and liberate Kuwait.
Okay, now I hope that little history lesson wasn't too drawn out, too dull, too boring. Yeah, when it comes down to me explaining this stuff, I could go on for fucking hours. But let's first start with uniforms, particularly the camouflage patterns. Now, I've got 3 of the patterns that were used in the conflict. I'm wearing one of them, got the other 2 here. The last one, I'm going to have to make a little video and picture slide presentation to explain it. But let's first kick this off with the more iconic pattern for that period. This particular one right here. This is the 6-color desert uniform, aka chocolate chip. The reason why this is called chocolate chip is because of the little splotches of the black and the white, kind of like the chocolate chip cookie almost. Now, this pattern was developed back in the 1960s when it was believed that the United States would have to deploy forces to the Middle East to help the Israelis, because at that particular time it was still the Cold War. We were operating in Vietnam, and a lot of the Arab nations that were warring with the Israelis were being backed by the Soviet Union as part of a greater proxy war against the U.S. However, when we were doing the testing, we were doing it in Southern California, and correct me if I'm wrong, but I think we also developed the pattern from the Sierra Nevada region of the U.S. So that way, theoretically, if we had to deploy troops to the Golan Heights or the Jordan River Valley, we could. But with that being said, the Israelis were able to hold their own and really decimate a lot of those armies back in those days, which was quite an achievement for a small nation, to say the least. But long story short, the 6-color pattern was shelved, though a lot of the stuff was still there. We used the pattern during the Bright Star exercises in the early 80s. We were using it on and off with the multinational forces observers who were monitoring the peace between Egypt and Israel. Then Saddam decided to pull his shit, invade Kuwait, and we had to deploy forces to the region pretty fucking quickly. We had troops already in place, but we had to bring a lot more in, a lot more materials to protect Saudi Arabia at the time. So a lot of Americans were deploying wearing this pattern. Now, with that being said, its first and only real actual combat use was in Desert Storm and in Somalia in '93, but we're focusing on Desert Storm right now. So that being said, the 6-color pattern received harsh criticism as the pattern was contrasting too much with the desert background in that particular region. So it was also noted that guys would be getting hotter because of how the color pattern was for it, particularly the black in there and stuff like that. But overall, the pattern is still iconic. A lot of guys were still deploying in the woodland uniform and had to wait a couple weeks or a couple months before getting the 6-color before Operation Desert Storm actually commenced. Some guys would have to rotate it out. Uniform History did a great video on all 3 of these patterns. Well, all 4 of the patterns I'm talking about. I'll put links in the description to this video, so there is that. But overall, the 6-color was still usable. We gave a lot of it to non-NATO allies, as well as a lot of our NATO allies actually copied it later on after the Gulf War, but that's a story for another time. The next pattern is going to be your 3-color desert pattern, also called Tricolor Desert or just DCU, Desert Combat Uniform. This one also has a nickname, Coffee Stain, because of the way the pattern is set up. A lot of it was with how when you have a cup of coffee, you may see how the stain from the cup would be left on paper, clothing, shit like that. So that is why the 3-color desert was designed the way it was. However, this testing for it began in the 80s when the Saudi Arabian government asked the US to help them develop a camouflage pattern that was to be used on vehicles and ultimately uniforms. So from then on, we helped them with the development, and we came to the conclusion that less was more for that particular region. And thankfully it happened like that, because the 3-color pattern actually got its more controlled field testing in Saudi Arabia during Desert Storm. A lot of rear security force units were using it. A lot of your support troops that were deep in Saudi Arabia used it, and you'll see it as very limited to the troops at large because of the logistics involved. But also a lot of the 3-color uniform pieces were being given out to certain officers. I think I can grab one of the late Norman Schwarzkopf wearing a 3-color parka with the 6-color uniform. Let me pull that one up. Yeah, you see what I'm talking about on that one. Now, the third pattern I'm going to be discussing is what I'm wearing right now. This is the M81 Woodland camouflage pattern. Now, you'll see a lot of pictures of guys deploying to Saudi Arabia wearing this uniform in the Woodland pattern, because we had a metric crap ton of the stuff in stock, because we were still in a Cold War mindset in 91, because we still were ready to fight the Soviet Union when the idea of a full-on Soviet invasion across the Fulda Gap into Germany was the biggest fear. So, naturally speaking, with that being said, we still had a lot of Woodland uniforms, and a lot of guys still wore that in Saudi Arabia until they got the 6-color uniforms just in time for Operation Desert Storm. So there is that one, and our last pattern that we're going to talk about is the Desert Night pattern. Now, I don't have this one on hand right now, so I will say that it was originally designed to deal with Soviet night vision at the time. Let me grab some pictures. Let me put together a little video explanation, so give me 1 second on that one.
Developed alongside the 6-color desert pattern, the Desert Night pattern was developed not with the intention of concealing soldiers in the visual spectrum, but to conceal them against Soviet night vision technology of the period. Now, with that being said, as you can see from the picture here, it looks like they used the same rollers for the 6-color pattern as they did for the Desert Night. So, with that being said, that's kind of how it was designed. But, long story short, technology for night vision improved since its inception, but the camouflage pattern did not. By the time Desert Storm rolled around, American snipers were doing testing of their own using American night vision goggles against the Desert Night pattern, and sadly, the pattern was technically obsolete by those standards. However, this pattern kind of became a popular fashion statement in years after. Even during the global war on terror, you can see this pattern being used sporadically by both American and British Special Forces personnel.
Alright, now that that one's out of the way, let's talk your headwear. Now, I got two different things here. I got your basic military issue patrol cap in the 6-color pattern, and I got the boonie hat. Now, back during the Gulf War, a lot of American troops wearing the 6-color patrol cap or the 8-point patrol cap favored by the Navy and the Marines were commercially produced and privately purchased. So those were not standard military issue for the time. Now, the boonie hat was a standard issue, though you'll find some pictures from the 60s with the rim around it for attaching the foliage stuff, because that was a particular hat design they were using in Vietnam, so it made some logistical sense to print a hat like that in the 6-color pattern. However, the majority of American troops in theater for the Gulf War would have a hat like this without that webbing around it. However, if you see a hat like in the 6-color with that webbing around there, that can be considered kosher still, but more often than not you'll see it like this, as far as without the webbing on here. Now, let's look at the PASGIT system, personal armor system for ground troops. This is a flak vest and a helmet that American forces were wearing as far back as the late 70s, well into the 80s. It was still issued into the 90s even. As I said, Uniform History has got some stuff on that kind of stuff, so I will have links in the description to this video on that, as well as hooked into my written article on this one. Now, I've got a 6-color PASGIT helmet cover on my airsoft PASGIT helmet. Now, it would be accurate because of this particular webbing here. This would make it accurate to the time period. Same goes with the OD green cat-eye band on here, but the tan one would be more after Desert Storm, more like Somalia, GWAT type stuff. Other than that, let me pull up some stuff talking about the flak vest, so give me 1 second on that one.
Okay, building off our experiences from the flak vest that we had in Vietnam, the PASGIT flak vest was a significant improvement, at least as far as comfort goes, though you did have nice padded shoulders here and the so-called grenade hangers. Yeah, I think that's how we got the idea for Molly, but I digress on that one. But during Desert Storm, you had that with the 6-color vest cover that goes on it, even though they're printed in woodland or very early models or OD. You got a picture of a vest cover right here, and later on you'd have a 3-color model, but that was kind of few and far between for Desert Storm.
Okay, now that's out of the way. I'm not going to pull out the boots, but as a little bit of an explanation on the boots, you'll see pictures of guys wearing black jump boots, black jungle boots, or even the Vietnam period jungle boots. Keep in mind that because we were preparing to fight in Europe against the Soviets, there wasn't a lot of the tan desert boots to go around, so you'd see it with guys that were already in theater. You'll see this with Schwarzkopf and some of his guys, but other than that, more often than not, it's going to be the rank and file troops that are wearing the jungle boots from Vietnam or the all-black leather combat boots. The same could be said with patches, too. Because we were still getting ready for the whole Fold the Gap scenario to unfold, it would not be uncommon for American forces, particularly the United States Army, to have the patches from their woodland uniforms stitched onto their 6-color desert uniforms. You'd even see that with the 3-color desert too up until 94. But with that being said, yes, you will find the tan patches from the period on 6-color uniforms, but that was few and far between. It depended upon the unit SOPs, and when they were in country, and a whole bunch of stuff like that. This is where I would encourage you to do your own research on something like that. So let's talk about their field gear. Give me 1 minute. Alright, let's talk about field gear. The kind of stuff that the guys used in actual combat. I got 2 different pieces of a kit here. Now, one thing, keep this in mind. This stuff can vary depending upon the unit that you may want to recreate, SOPs for that particular time frame, and things like that. However, generally speaking, all this kit's going to be standard across the board for Army and Marine Corps, so keep that in mind. Some things are going to be more special operations. I'll let you know on which ones that is, but first off, let's talk web gear. This is your basic Alice web kit. This is the stuff that troops would have as standard issue going into Desert Storm. It's M72 gear, Deuce gear, Alice gear. This one setup in particular is your LC2 variant, and you can tell that by the belt. Now, the belt is going to be this, what's called the gray buckle or Bianchi style pistol belt. As you can see, this particular belt design was the one that was the standard issue for troops in the early to mid 80s, and it was the standard issue when we were going into the Gulf War. Same goes with the Y suspenders. The Y suspenders were standard for this particular kit. However, even in Desert Storm, you'll find soldiers that are still using the old H harnesses, either the M1956, M1967, or a commercial version of the Alice harness in the H format. So those would have been more private purchase off a surplus site, or whatever stocks were still in there but not being doled out to the troops. So with that being said, as I said, depends upon the unit, the SOPs, but for general purpose, stick with the Y suspenders. Magazine pouches, pretty much Alice mag pouches. I've discussed the Alice gear to great length, so you could check that particular video out in an annotation right here or wherever I can put it. Same goes with the LBV-88 I'm going to talk about in a second, and you get the general idea. Now, the cool thing about these mag pouches, they can hold 2 M67 fragmentation grenades. You airsoft guys are probably using the Enola Gay EG67 grenades, which I want to give a try at one point or another. But long story short, the magazine pouch is standard issue. Can hold 3 30-round mags of 5.56 for your M16 AR platforms and any other NATO standard rifle in that caliber. You guys would use these things as improvised first aid kits, GP pouches. For all of us paintball players that use a hopper fed, they do work very well holding a 75 to 100 round pod depending upon the design. So you easily have something you could stash in here for that one. However, if you're running something like a 308 battle rifle, like your M14s, your FAOs, your G3s, which a lot of our coalition partners had, then these pouches would be good for that too. Could hold 2 20 round mags of 308 or 7.62 by 51 NATO in each one of these pouches. AKs, not so much though. Not that many of coalition countries used AKs, but If you were using these pouches with an AK, then it would be the 20 round AK mags for the AMD 65, but I digress on that one. Overall, this kit is set up as a basic rifleman slash special forces recon kit. You got 4 mag pouches, which is 12 mags total, 2 canteens, and a butt pack. Now, this butt pack is not a standard issue. This is a Blackhawk butt pack that was produced in the mid-90s to early 2000s. The appropriate butt pack for your Alice setup would be the nylon version of the M1956 field training pack, i.e. butt pack, and a OD version of the first aid slash compass pouch as well. So keep that in mind as far as uniform kit goes. Anything that's standard GI issue is going to be in olive drab. The other pouches that would be worth looking into, depending upon your gear setup, would be these particular saw pouches. These were standard issue for guys that were carrying the saw guns, the M60s, because we still had the M60 and the M60E3 in the inventory for Desert Storm, depending upon what unit you're running with. But overall, you take a box of 200 rounds of 5.56 for the saws, or the 100 round belt of 7.62 for the M60 and your 308 caliber machine guns. For MagFed players, you can put 4 20 round magazines in here like I've got here, or 2 100 round paintball pods, depending upon what kind of setup you're running with. Moving on, we've got the LBV 88 tactical load bearing vest. You will find these in Woodland. You may find these in Desert Tan even for Desert Storm, but generally speaking, they would either be Woodland or Olive Drab as far as I know. The Desert Tan versions of this particular vest would be commercially produced, private purchase, or only for U.S. Special Forces, because this vest in particular, or as far as the LBV 88 goes, was a standard for the U.S. Special Forces, at least until the mid-90s. So with that being said, if you're running a Special Forces look, this vest would definitely be the de facto one, unless you're running an Alice rig. Now, let's talk weapons and protective gear for this particular conflict. So, let's start off with the weaponry.
Where we can blame the United States Army Ordnance Corps for the debacle that was the M16 in Vietnam, all the credit or blame has to be laid on the United States Marine Corps marksmanship team for the development of the M16A2. Keep in mind, these Marine shooters go to Camp Perry to do their marksmanship competitions, and their input was what was the driving force behind the M16A2 rifle. Be it that the gun was an excellent weapon and a vast improvement over the A1, the thing was that the rear sight was considered too complicated by experienced shooters, and the 3-round burst was erratic to say the least. Needless to say, if you're doing a Desert Storm impression, this is the one you need. However, to make it for a paintball gun, that's going to be a little easier said than done, considering that most of the industry focuses on the carbine version, but finding parts to cannibalize to do a custom job isn't difficult. Problem is putting it all together, but it can be. Okay, take a look at the guy on point with the glasses and the carbine in hand bodyguarding Schwarzkopf. Now, for guys like General Schwarzkopf, most of his personal protection detail are going to be your Tier 1 guys. In this case, Army Delta Force. Now, keep in mind, there was no M4 carbine in military service during Desert Storm. Instead, these were pretty much considered commercial, off-the-shelf guns that were acquired by U.S. SOCOM. What's pictured here is one that was built by former Delta operator Larry Vickers, a retired Army Master Sergeant, and this is based on the CAR-15 or Colt 723 he used during Operation Acid Gambit in Panama in 1989, as well as when he was in Operation Desert Storm. Now, the red dot sight on here is going to be the Aimpoint 2000. This is what made Aimpoint a household name in military circles. Other than that, you got a dive light hose clamped on here. You got 2 magazines duct taped together for a faster reload. Now, you've got that profile barrel, which would be similar to what the M4 has today, but you would also find other versions that have the so-called pencil barrel, like pictured right here. Other than that, this is pretty much basically everything what became the M4 today. As you can see with this Navy SEAL here, I'm not sure if this picture is from Desert Storm, but as you can see, he's got a 203 grenade launcher hooked onto that carbine. So this thing was flexible enough to meet those particular requirements for the U.S. military. However, the carbines were more of a special forces deal. Now, as far as paintball guns go, if you need a quick solution for an out-of-the-box, you got something like this Army Alpha Black pictured here, which is a 98 derivative. You've got markers like the classic Tippmann X7, the Phenom, or if you want a mag-fed, you can go with this Tippmann TMC, and they will not let you down. Let's talk some firepower, particularly that of the automatic rifleman. This pictured here is the FN Mini-Me machine gun. This thing is adopted by the United States military as the M249 squad automatic weapon. This becomes the automatic rifleman's weapon, and it's pretty much designed to keep pace with fast-moving infantry, hence the reason why it's chambered in a 5.56 by 45 millimeter NATO, feeds off a 200-round disintegrating belt, or could also feed standard GI Stanag magazines. This weapon came into military service in the 80s with Panama, Grenada, and right into Desert Storm. Definitely a good weapon to work with from all accounts. Now, for us paintball guys, we got some options. We got this one pictured here, which is set up for the Tippmann A5. This is probably as kosher as you could get if you're running an A5 on a hopper fed. However, you look at this one right here from Modern Combat Sports. This is a special order. You could have this one on a Q loader or as a box mag fed setup if you're looking for a good squad support weapon. But if you want something a little more custom made, Eric Engler's got your back. As you can see pictured here is a saw gun built off a X7 Phenom. Developed by the Guylam division of General Motors as submachine gun caliber .45 M3, it was manufactured as a more affordable and easier to produce alternative to the M1 Thompson submachine gun. During World War II, it was developed with a conversion kit to convert it from .45 ACP to German standard 9x19 Parabellum. It could also be fitted with a suppressor, making it a firm favorite among paratroops and covert operators of the OSS for the time. Went on to work very well in Korea and in Vietnam, where it had a reputation with special forces as well as the common grunt across the board. The M3 was definitely a firm favorite, but particularly with the U.S. Special Forces, units like MACV-SOG, the Mike Force, and Navy SEALs routinely used it on clandestine missions. And the M3 grease gun served all the way up into the Persian Gulf War, where it was still used by American tankers. Now, as far as a paintball gun setup goes for it, that's going to be more of a custom job, so you might want to email Eric Engler on that one. Going up against Germany's MG-34 and MG-42 was a sobering experience for any American soldier during the Second World War. After the conflict, the U.S. began development of its own general-purpose machine gun that was belt-fed, and this was the M60 machine gun, chambered in the 7.62 by 51mm NATO. The M60 got its first baptism by fire in the jungles of Vietnam, affectionately given the nickname the Pig because of the ammo belts would drag in dirt, debris, and all that other stuff. However, needless to say, the M60 was still a very respected weapon even after Vietnam. Plus, after the conflict, even though the original M60 was still well in the inventory, it was still one of those things that was continuously tweaked on even during and after Vietnam, with many versions coming out, such as the M60E2, which was a coaxial version or a helicopter mounted version. But then we get to the more modern variant that came around by the time of the 80s, the M60E3 light machine gun. This thing was in service with a lot of the Marine infantry units as well as Special Forces units, particularly Navy SEALs. But needless to say, during Desert Storm, best thing to figure out, the M60E3 was a Marine Corps thing. The other general purpose M60, the classic E1, was still pretty much in the Army. But with that being said, this weapon is stout and it's pretty potent. For all you paintball guys, there is a mag-fed version that is custom ordered through Modern Combat Sports, so keep that one in mind, though it is expensive. You can't exactly have the 90s without talking about the Heckler & Koch MP5 submachine gun, chambered for the 9x19mm standard NATO cartridge. This weapon system was a real cultural icon, even as far back as the 1980s, being used by such units as the 22nd SAS Regiment of the United Kingdom, U.S. Army's Elite Delta Force, the German Federal Border Police GSG-9. However, for Desert Storm, this weapon was more of a backseat in the hands of military security personnel protecting air bases, but it was still up front in the hands of units like the Navy SEALs, as they were hitting Kuwaiti oil tankers that were off the coast that were guarded by the Iraqis. That being said, the MP5 is still a no-holds-barred type of weapon to work with, especially if you want to be a covert operator for the 90s, and for paintball versions to work on that. Nothing says better than the Tippmann A5, as it looks like the MP5K. Then you got other markers like the BT Delta, the classic Tippmann X7, which is pictured right here, as well as its successor, the X7 Phenom. Parts are still plentiful for all the above. You can still find these for good prices on eBay. So, there you go. Okay, now final piece of protective equipment that we're going to be discussing here is going to be the M17A1 gas mask. This thing was a godsend for all those guys that were in Desert Storm, because at the time we knew Saddam was a nut job. We knew he had no issues launching chemical weapons. He did on the Kurds during the Iran-Iraq War, and everyone feared he was going to drop them on Israel, as you see pictured here with how we're checking out a Scud. Now, with that being said, this mask was pretty good. You could still drink out of it. The only problem is that it was a cheek filter, and replacing those filters was a nightmare, especially under combat conditions if you had to use it. Thank God we never had to, but this is one thing that we placed very special emphasis on during training with this particular matter.
Okay, and that about does it. This concludes our video on the weapons, uniforms, and gear worn by the U.S. military during the 1991 Persian Gulf War. If you guys are liking what you're seeing, don't forget to smash that like button, share this video around, leave a comment, let YouTube know and their algorithm know that this is the kind of content you want to see. If you want to read the written version of this, check that out over at outerheavenpaintball.blogspot.com. And finally, if you need rail accessories for your AR platform, molly gear, tactical slings, check out acidtactical.com. And remember, when the shit hits the fan and you've got to trust your gear with your life, ask yourself this one question: can your gear survive the acid test? Anyway, this is Big Boss, and I'm out of here.